Perspective is the study of how objects change in appearance when the spot from which we view them changes. Now, foreshortening is a particular type of perspective, and it describes how, as an object moves further away from us, it becomes visually compressed. And this facade of the Musée du Louvre is a great example. This is an object which is moving away from us. This part of the facade is closer than this part down here. Everything that we see up here becomes compressed, narrowed. It takes up less space the further down it goes. So the space between the windows closer to us is this large, but the space between these windows down here is only a fraction of that same space. These columns become narrower. And they compress horizontally, but they do compress vertically as well. So we see that these closer columns are significantly taller than these ones much further away. And sadly, foreshortening is one of those aspects of perspective where if we don't get it correct, it can draw attention to itself because it says something's not right here. It's like a note in a song that's out of tune. And when I look at drawings of my students and people I see on Instagram, there are 3 mistakes I see over and over again, and they're easily fixed. So let's have a look at them. So let me draw a wall of windows that show this mistake. And here's our first mistake. Can you see the problem here? There is an understanding of foreshortening, and that these windows, as they move further away from us, become visually compressed. They become narrower and narrower. However, I've forgotten that the gaps between the windows also have to become compressed. So how should this look? Something more like this, where as well as the windows narrowing, the spaces between the windows narrow as well. And they need to both narrow at the same rate as each other. So what's the second common mistake in foreshortening? Let me draw it out for you. Can you see the problem here? This one may be the least obvious if you don't actually know it. The problem here is while we've nicely foreshortened the widths of the windows as well as the spaces between the windows, inside the window we've drawn exactly the same view of window. So I've copied what's in this closest window and then I've just put it in the rest of the windows. And that's not what happens with foreshortening. So what does happen? Let me show you. And to make it clearer, I'll just add a bit of tone behind these windows. Does this make it easier to see? What I want you to notice is as well as the windows becoming narrower and the gaps between the windows becoming more narrow, what we actually see inside the window also changes as the windows move further away. It's not just that what we see has to be squeezed in to less and less space, but what we see actually changes. So if we look at this window here, we can see that it's a window divided into 4 equal spaces. Already we see less of these panes of glass because they're partly obscured by the thickness of the wall space. And the further back into a wall or into decorative surrounds a window pane of glass actually is, the greater the degree that this happens. And so when we move to the next window, we can still see the 4 panes of glass, but these 2 on the left-hand side are proportionately narrower than the closer one. And when we move to the next window, it's the same, but more extreme. When we move to the 4th window, we actually can't see any of the 2 left-hand side panes of glass. On the 5th window, we can't see all of the right-hand side panes of glass. And by the time we get to the 7th window, we can see hardly any of the glass at all. Whereas in this top one, I've put this cross in the center of each of those windows. And this is where careful observation pays off. A quick look and the closest framing may look as though it's in the center when it's actually slightly off center. And then without looking back at our reference, we just do the same thing, presuming it's the same, but narrower in each of them. So it's not just that there's visual compression, but what we see actually changes. And here's the third example of a common mistake I see. Can you see what the problem here is? Let me show how it should be done. The problem is that the tops and the bottom of the windows don't line up with the perspective lines. To give an exaggerated view, that it looks more like this. It's as if the top of the windows form a series of steps sloping slightly downwards or sloping upwards, when in fact the tops of these windows needs to form a nice straight line that fits in with all of the other perspective angles. And I think this happens because we're concentrating on getting these vertical lines in place, and we're concentrating on getting the foreshortening correct, making the lines and the spaces close enough together, that we just lose track of the importance of keeping the tops of these perspective lines in place. When we're drawing each window individually, it's very difficult to get a sense of exactly how this line needs to go in relation to this line. And whenever I'm doing this sort of thing, I will always draw all the vertical lines in place first, and then I will draw the perspective lines all as almost one continuous line, just lifting the pen off for the gaps between the windows. And that ensures that we get a nice, smooth, perspective correct line along the top and the bottom of the windows. So let's have a look at this in real life. This is the front of a building in Edinburgh in Scotland, and we can see that there's a number of windows that are all equally spaced in life, sitting between these square columns. And we can see here in this closest window that the top window is probably divided into 3 vertical sections and 2 horizontal sections, and we can just see the top and bottom pane of glass on the right hand side and a little bit of the middle ones. In the second window, we really can't see anything of the center panes of glass. And by the time we get to this final window, the panes of glass have actually really disappeared. And so we do in fact see that it's not just that we see this view, but more and more squeezed, more and more compressed into a smaller space, but actually what we see changes. And of course we can easily see that the tops of the windows form a beautiful, tight perspective line that fits in with all the other perspective lines in the building. So we need to make sure that when we do these lines, we do them as carefully as we do the more obvious vertical lines. And it would be a shame not to draw at least a little bit of this, wouldn't it? Understanding the various patterns that foreshortening creates in an object we're looking at, particularly in architecture, makes it easier for us to find those things when we observe our subject and observe them accurately. And of course, that gives us a chance, a very good chance of drawing them accurately. Don't be put off by foreshortening, even when it's quite complex. It's a great tool in drawing realistic architecture to understand foreshortening fully. So don't be satisfied with not quite getting it right, but get on top of it and draw some really impressive architectural scenes.